Ever stop to think about who should be making the really important decisions in our society? And why is it that we trust some people, politicians maybe, or judges, or even, that one friend who knows everything more than others?
Yeah, it's fundamental. And underneath it all is this crucial idea, accountability, especially in government.
Exactly. Accountability.
That's the core of what we're digging into today. This deep dive, it explores the fascinating work of Eric Maskin and Jean Tirole in their 2004 paper, The Politician and the Judge, Accountability in Government.
Right.
It's really a look at the different ways societies can make decisions and, well, who we trust with that power.
Now, for you, our listener, who's keen on getting the smart take without, wading through pages and pages, consider this your shortcut. We've done the sifting, gone through some pretty dense research to bring you the key insights, those aha moments, without drowning you in, like academic jargon.
Yeah, exactly. Our mission today is to really understand the logic behind these different ways of deciding things. Like, when is it best for everyone to vote directly?
Right.
When should we rely on elected officials, the politicians, as Maskin and Tirole call them?
Right.
And when might unelected folks, like their judges, be the right choice? We're especially interested in how that whole reelection thing changes how public officials act.
And to get there, we're digging into a really foundational study, this paper from the American Economic Review, Top Thinkers.
Yep.
They built this neat model, maybe a bit simplified, but it lets them compare three main systems. Direct democracy, where we all vote. Representative democracy with those accountable politicians, and then governance by non-accountable officials, the judges.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. What's the central puzzle, the main tension they're trying to figure out?
Well, the fundamental puzzle they tackle is the inherent trade-off with accountability itself. It's sort of tricky. On the one hand, the fact that politicians need to be reelected gives us, the public, a pretty powerful tool. We can, weed out those who aren't doing a good job and encourage them to act responsibly. It's accountability as a way to keep them in line.
Right. If we don't like what they're doing, boom, vote them out next time. Simple.
Exactly. But here's the catch, the flip side. That very same pressure, the need to get reelected, it can lead to what the authors call pandering.
Pandering. Okay.
Officials might start prioritizing popular decisions just to win votes, even if those decisions aren't actually the best for society in the long run. And they might overlook, the needs of smaller groups.
So it's a balancing act. We want our leaders to listen to us, but not just chase whatever's hot in the polls this week.
Precisely.
Now, the paper talks about why we even bother having representatives. Why not just vote on everything ourselves? Direct democracy for everything.
That's a really important question, and they tackle it head on. Maskin and Tirole highlight the classic arguments for having representatives, for delegating power. The basic idea is that elected officials are, well, expected to bring more to the table than the average citizen. Ideally, right?
Okay. More experience.
Yeah, more experience making these kinds of decisions, maybe better judgment from doing it over time, and access to more detailed information to make, informed choices.
Makes sense. It's like going to a mechanic instead of trying to fix your transmission after watching one YouTube video. Probably a good idea.
Yeah, good analogy. And the authors also point out that representatives have a stronger incentive to put in the effort to make good decisions.
How so?
Well, in a big society, your individual vote or opinion can feel pretty small, right? Which leads to that free rider problem. Why spend hours getting deeply informed if your single vote feels like a drop in the ocean?
Yeah, I can see that.
But for representatives, their job, their reputation, it kind of depends on it. Or at least it's supposed to.
Okay, so delegating has its pluses, expertise, incentives. But the paper also raises a red flag about direct democracy, this idea of the tyranny of the majority.
That's, a bit scary. It is a serious concern. And it's not new. It's been discussed for centuries. James Madison, for instance, was very worried about it.
Right.
The worry is that in a pure direct democracy, where every single decision goes to a popular vote, the rights and interests of smaller groups, minorities, can just get steamrolled.
Yeah.
They can be easily ignored or even actively harmed if a larger group, the majority, is united by some common interest that disadvantages the minority.
So if 51% of people want something, the other 49% just have to lump it, even if it's really unfair or damaging to them.
That's the core of the worry, yeah.
Yeah.
While direct democracy seems like the most direct expression of the public will, it doesn't automatically guarantee fairness or protect everyone's rights.
Okay. Now let's get back to these officials we elect, the representatives. What makes them tick, according to this model? What are they really after?
Maskin and Tirole simplify it down to two main drivers. First, there's the desire to leave a legacy.
A legacy, like history books.
Yeah, exactly. To be remembered positively for doing important things, for making a difference. Though, crucially, what they consider great might not always line up perfectly with what benefits society overall.
Okay, so legacy is one. What's the other?
The second motivator is simply the value of holding office itself. You know, the perks.
Right. Salary, staff.
Prestige, connections, the ability to influence things. Just the benefits of being in that position of power.
Okay, so we have these officials who want to be remembered.
Yeah.
And they like being in power.
Mm-hmm.
How does the chance of being reelected and this whole accountability thing connect to those motivations?
Right. So reelection becomes this really powerful lever to tap into those desires. And it can lead to two main potential benefits for the public.
Okay, what are they?
The first is what they call moral hazard correcting. Think of it like this. Even if an official's personal goals aren't exactly the same as the public's, the need to get reelected can push them or nudge them to act more in the public's interest, especially when it's hard for us to perfectly see if their decisions were actually the right ones.
So it's like maybe they don't really want to do the right thing, but they do it anyway to look good for the voters come election time.
That's one way to put it, yeah. They might act as if their interests align with the public's. The second benefit is adverse selection correcting.
Adverse selection, what's that?
It means that over time, through elections, we get to see what an official actually does. We observe their actions and can make a judgment about whether their underlying values, their type, seem similar to ours.
Oh.
If they consistently seem out of step, if their decisions don't sit right with us, we can vote them out and choose someone else who seems like a better fit. It's like sorting the good apples from the bad ones over multiple election cycles.
Okay, so accountability helps nudge behavior and helps us pick better representatives over time. Sounds pretty good in theory.
It does.
But we've already touched on the downsides. Let's dig a bit deeper into those drawbacks, this pandering problem and the potential harm to minority rights.
Right. Pandering, as we said, is the risk that officials choose actions simply because they're popular, even if they know those actions aren't the best for society in the long run.
Their main goal becomes just winning the next election.
Exactly. Not necessarily making the optimal decision. It's like a doctor prescribing a sugar pill because the patient really, really wants something, even though the doctor knows it won't actually help the underlying condition.
Yeah, okay, and this really goes against the whole point of representative democracy, doesn't it? Weren't representatives supposed to use their own judgment and expertise? I remember reading something, wasn't it George Clymer?
Yes. At the U.S. Constitutional Convention, he said a representative is appointed to think for and not with his constituents.
Think for, not with. That really sums it up.
It does. It highlights that intended role. So pandering basically undermines that whole idea of representatives using their specialized knowledge or better judgment.
Okay, so that's pandering. What about the risk to minority rights? How does accountability play into that?
Well, the very fact that the majority holds the power to vote officials out can inadvertently give that majority too much sway over government decisions. If an official is constantly focused on keeping the majority happy to ensure re-election, they might become less responsive or even ignore the needs and concerns of small groups.
So the majority rules and the minority gets left behind.
That's the concern. The worry is that the majority's will, expressed through voting, could end up being consistently unfair or harmful to those in the minority. Think about, say, local zoning fights or even big national referendums. The majority preference might have a really negative and maybe unjust impact on a smaller group.
Okay, this sets the stage nicely for comparing the different systems. The paper then looks at how direct democracy, DD, judicial power, JP, and representative democracy, RG, work in a situation where we don't immediately know if a decision was the right one. No instant feedback.
Exactly, the no feedback scenario.
Let's start with direct democracy. What does the model say happens then?
Okay, so in this setup, without any quick way to know if we made the best choice, decisions under direct democracy are simply based on what the voters initially believe is the right thing to do, their prior beliefs.
Right.
And the model defines action A as the popular action, the one that people think is more likely than not to be the best option. So direct democracy will just tend to choose action A again and again.
So we just go with the popular gut feeling, basically. Makes sense that there's no feedback? What about judicial power? These unelected judges in the same scenario. No feedback, no reelection worries.
Right. Under judicial power, the official, the judge, doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. So they'll just consistently choose the action that they prefer in each situation, whatever aligns with their own views or goals.
Okay, but how does that relate to what's best for society?
Well, the model assumes a certain fraction of these potential judges are congruent, meaning their preferences happen to align with what the public would want if the public were fully informed about the best outcome.
Ah, okay, so some judges might just happen to want the same thing as the ideally informed public.
Exactly. So the overall outcome under judicial power really depends on the probability of getting one of those congruent judges. It's a bit of a lottery based on who gets appointed.
Okay, so D&D is driven by popular belief, JP, by the judge's personal preference, which might or might not be good. Now, representative democracy, RD. This seems more complicated. The model splits it based on how much the politician cares about staying in office, right?
Precisely. They introduced this concept, a notional discount factor, let's call it delta. You can think of it as how much a politician values holding office in the next period compared to, say, achieving their legacy goal now.
Okay. High delta mean they really want to stay in power.
Exactly. If delta is high, they'll do almost anything to get reelected. If delta is low, they might be more willing to risk losing office for a decision they believe in or one that aligns with their legacy goals.
So let's take the first case. The desire to stay in office is really strong. High delta. What happens in RD then?
When that desire is very strong, specifically, when delta is greater than 1 in their model, they predict we get full pandering.
Full pandering. Just do whatever's popular.
Yes. The politician, desperate to get reelected, will always choose the popular action, action A, in the first term, regardless of their own private preference or what they might secretly believe is the optimal choice.
And what does that mean for the voters?
It means we learn nothing about the politician's true type, whether they're congruent or not. Because they always do the popular thing, we just reelect them if they did what we expected, Jose. We never find out if they actually agree with us or if they just did it for the votes.
Oof, that sounds bad. Representative democracy isn't really working then.
It's not performing its screening function at all. The chilling takeaway here is that when politicians desperately want to stay in power and there's no immediate feedback on their decisions, we might end up with leaders who just tell us what we want to hear, and we never find out if they're actually competent or aligned with our real interests. RD is basically dominated by either DD or JP in this scenario.
Okay, that's the pessimistic case. What happens when that desire to stay in office is weaker? Lower delta, less than 1.
When that desire isn't all-consuming, the picture changes. The politician is now more likely to choose the action they personally prefer in the first term. They value their legacy or personal conviction more than guaranteeing re-election.
Ah, so they act on their beliefs.
Yes. And this is crucial because it gives us, the voters, a chance to learn something about what kind of politician they are. If they choose the popular action A, we might think, okay, maybe they're congruent with us. If they choose the unpopular action B, we get a different signal.
And then re-election depends on?
Re-election still depends on whether they chose the popular action A. So congruent politicians who prefer A will choose A and get reelected. Non-congruent politicians who prefer B will choose B and likely get voted out.
So now elections actually do something useful. We can start to sort the politicians based on their actions.
Exactly. The adverse selection mechanism starts working. RD now dominates judicial power because it allows us to potentially remove those non-congruent officials, whereas with JP, we're stuck with whoever we get.
Right. So in this case, RD seems better than JP.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it compare to just having direct democracy in the first place?
The model gets specific here. It lays out a condition equation 2 in the paper for those following along for when this weaker form of RD is actually better than DD.
Okay, what's the gist of it?
Basically, it depends on the interplay between how likely we are to get a congruent official initially, that's relevant for JP and RD, and how confident we are in our initial belief that the popular action A is actually the right one. That's key for DD.
So even if we think we probably know the right answer, A is popular, having a representative who might have their own views, and then giving us a chance to replace them if we don't like their choices, that can still be better overall.
Yes, under certain conditions. RD, even with imperfect politicians, offers this chance to learn and correct, which DD doesn't. It's a valuable mechanism.
That's a key insight. Accountability via elections can be really valuable for sorting officials, but how much it matters really depends on how badly those officials want to stay in power.
Precisely.
Now, the paper also briefly mentions that the importance of the decision itself can play a role. How does that fit in?
That's right. While the baseline model treats all decisions kind of equally, the authors acknowledge that in reality, some decisions are just bigger.
Like going to war or major economic reforms.
Exactly. Things with huge consequences, things that really shape the future and leave a lasting mark. For these really significant decisions, that delta, the desire to just keep the job, might become less important compared to the desire to get this big decision right for the sake of their legacy.
Ah, so the legacy motive might trump the office-holding motive for really monumental choices.
That's the idea they float. If a politician is facing a truly historic decision, they might be less inclined to just pander to current opinion and more focused on how history will judge them.
And what does that imply for the choice of system?
Well, this reduced incentive to pander on major legacy-defining issues could make representative democracy, RD, a better bet than judicial power, JP, because RD still has that election mechanism for accountability later on.
Okay.
However, they also add a caveat. If these really important decisions also happen to have a very clear, widely agreed upon best outcome,
Then maybe just vote on it directly.
then maybe direct democracy, DD, is still the most effective way to go. Get the public consensus directly.
Interesting. So it's really not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah.
The best system seems to depend on the type of decision, the motivations, the feedback, lots of factors.
Definitely.
The paper then briefly touches on whether there might be even better ways to make decisions beyond just these three basic systems, right? Like more complex designs.
Yes, they dip into the realm of mechanism design, thinking about, could we design more sophisticated rules for making decisions and holding people accountable?
And could we?
In theory, yes. They suggest that systems that explicitly tie the probability of re-election to the actual outcomes of decisions could lead to better results.
Okay, pay for performance, basically.
Sort of. But the problem is, these kinds of systems often rely on being able to make the probability of re-election legally contractable. Like, you can write a contract that guarantees a certain chance of re-election if a certain outcome occurs.
And that's hard to do in real politics.
Extremely hard, probably impossible in most democratic contexts. Politics doesn't usually work with those kinds of binding contracts on election chances.
Yeah, I could see that. Did they mention any other, maybe more practical alternatives?
They do mention one interesting hybrid idea. Start with representative democracy. But if the incumbent representative is voted out, the next decision on that issue is made by direct democracy.
Oh, interesting. So if we fire our rep, the people vote directly on the next round. That's a novel concept.
It is. It could potentially combine some benefits of both systems under certain conditions.
Now, a big assumption in the model so far is that officials always know what the best course of action is. But in reality, figuring that out takes effort, right? It can be costly. How does that change things?
That's a critical point, and they address it. The baseline model simplifies by assuming perfect information for the official. But you're right, getting the information needed doing the research, consulting experts often requires real effort and resources.
So does accountability help or hurt that information gathering?
Maskin and Tirole argue it can actually hurt. Politicians under representative democracy might be less willing to invest time and resources in finding this costly information.
Why? That seems counterintuitive.
Because what if they do the hard work, spend the resources, and discover that the objectively best action is actually unpopular? If they choose that unpopular but correct action, they risk getting voted out. So the fear of losing their job could actually discourage them from doing the necessary homework if the answer might be politically inconvenient.
Wow. So accountability could lead to less informed decisions in some cases.
That's the potential downside they highlight. On the other hand, unelected judges who don't face that immediate re-election pressure.
They don't have that same disincentive.
Exactly. They have less reason not to invest in acquiring that decision-relevant information because they don't have to worry about popularity contests in the same way.
So what's the implication?
It suggests that for highly technical decisions, things that require deep, specialized knowledge, and where public opinion might not be well-formed or accurate, maybe non-accountable officials like judges are actually better suited.
That's a bit of a surprise. We often think elected officials should be the ones making the tough, expert calls. But maybe not always.
Maybe not always. If the cost of getting the info right is high and the political cost of acting on it is also high, judges might be better positioned.
On the flip side, the paper also mentions that politicians do have an incentive to learn something else, public opinion, which the model sees as potentially wasteful. Why is finding out what people want wasteful?
Well, within the model's framework, remember, The optimal action is objective. It doesn't actually change based on what the public thinks is best at any given moment, even though public opinion reflects those initial prior beliefs.
Okay.
So any resources the politician spends on polling, focus groups, trying to gauge public opinion that's seen as effort diverted from finding the objectively best solution, it's effort spent learning how to pander, essentially.
Right. Which an unelected judge wouldn't need to do.
Correct. They wouldn't have that same electoral incentive to track public sentiment just to improve their reelection chances.
So accountability can lead to a focus on popularity over optimality, and it might discourage investing in finding the actual best solution if it's costly or unpopular. Man, it's complicated.
It really is. No easy answers.
The paper also briefly touches on term lengths for judges.
Yeah.
How long should these non-accountable officials serve? What does the model suggest?
Okay, so the basic model, assuming voters are risk neutral, meaning they just care about the average outcome, doesn't actually show significant difference between judges serving for 1 term versus 2. But then they consider what happens if the electorate is risk averse.
Meaning people prefer smoother, more predictable outcomes. They don't like big swings.
Exactly. If voters dislike the uncertainty of getting a really bad or incompetent judge for a long time, then shorter terms become more appealing.
Why?
Because shorter terms mean more frequent opportunities to draw a new judge from the pool. It's like diversifying your portfolio, you get more draws, reducing the risk of being stuck with one really bad pick for too long.
Okay, so shorter terms for judges might reduce risk for the public.
Potentially, yes. But, as always, there's a trade-off. You have to balance that against the downsides of frequent turnover.
Like what?
Well, the costs of selecting and setting up new officials, the loss of accumulated experience, learning by doing, all that stuff. So the ideal term length is probably some compromise between minimizing the public's risk and maximizing efficiency through judicial experience.
Makes sense. What about the scope of power? Why do judges often seem to have narrower areas of authority compared to politicians? Does the model explain that?
It does offer an interesting perspective on that. The model suggests that elected officials, the accountable ones, should actually have more discretion, a wider sphere of action than unelected ones.
Really? Why?
The reasoning is that the decisions made by accountable politicians, even if they sometimes pander or get things wrong, provide valuable information to the public.
Information about what?
About the politician's type, their competence, their congruence, their priorities. We observe their choices across a range of issues, and we can use that information when we vote in the next election to decide if we want to keep them.
Ah, so their actions, even flawed ones, help us learn.
Exactly. But the decisions of unelected judges don't serve that same informational purpose for future accountability because there is no future electoral accountability for them.
So we give politicians more leeway because we can hold them responsible later at the ballot box. Judges, lacking that direct feedback loop, should have clearer, perhaps narrower, mandates.
That's the logic derived from the model, yes. It's an interesting justification for differences in discretionary power.
It really is. And finally, before we move on from this no-feedback world, the paper looks at campaign promises. Are they worth the paper they're written on, according to the model?
Well, the model suggests it depends entirely on whether those promises are credible and, crucially, binding.
Okay. What if they're not binding? Just cheap talk.
If candidates can just say whatever they think voters want to hear to get elected without any real commitment to follow through, then promises are basically meaningless. They're just strategic noise, tools to win votes, not signals of future actions.
Okay, so cheap talk is useless. What if promises are somehow binding? Like a candidate pledges their preferred action and is somehow held to it.
Now that changes things. If promises are binding, maybe through reputation or some institutional mechanism, though that's tricky, then they can become really useful.
How?
If candidates pledge their true intended actions, and there are enough candidates doing this, voters can potentially infer valuable information. For example, they might be able to figure out the optimal action by seeing which action is promised by a higher proportion of candidates, assuming candidates have some private information.
So if promises are real, they can actually help voters aggregate information and make better choices.
Potentially, yes. Binding promises could turn campaigns into a mechanism for revealing information about the best policy. But again, that hinges on the promises being genuinely binding, which is a big if.
Right. Empty words don't help much. Okay, we've thoroughly explored the no-feedback situation. Now, the paper moves on to the more realistic case where there's at least a chance we'll find out later if the first decision was actually the right one before the next election. How did this feedback change the game?
Yeah, introducing the possibility of feedback, learning whether the first decision was optimal before the second period, really shakes things up, especially for representative democracy.
Okay. Why not for the others?
Well, for direct democracy, each decision is kind of independent anyway. Feedback on a pass vote doesn't really change how people vote next time based on their current beliefs. And for judicial power, the judges still aren't worried about public opinion or reelection, so feedback doesn't alter their basic calculus.
Right. So for D-Day and JP, feedback doesn't fundamentally change their first period behavior. But for politicians who want to get reelected, it's a whole new ballgame.
Absolutely. It introduces strategic calculations about how current actions will look once the results are in. The model identifies some new potential behaviors. One key idea is something they call forward-looking pandering.
Forward-looking pandering. That sounds intriguing. What's that?
Okay, so in this scenario, the politician thinks ahead. They choose the action in the first period that they anticipate is most likely to be proven correct by the future feedback, regardless of their own personal preference or even current public opinion.
So they're not just pandering to what's popular now, they're trying to pander to the future, anticipated judgment of the voters based on the actual outcome.
Exactly. They're trying to set themselves up to look good when the results come in, hoping that will secure their reelection. This kind of behavior is more likely when there's a reasonably high probability in the model of getting that feedback before the election, and when the politician has a strong desire to stay in office, high delta.
And is this good or bad?
It can actually be good for society. It encourages officials to focus on actions that are likely to be genuinely effective in the long run, not just popular in the short term. The model shows that under the right conditions, enough feedback, strong office motive, this forward-looking pandering can become the dominant equilibrium, leading politicians to choose the optimal action more often.
Wow, okay. So accountability plus feedback can actually incentivize doing the right thing, even if it's not popular right now, because politicians anticipate being judged by the results later.
Precisely. It harnesses that reelection motive in a potentially very positive way.
That sounds like maybe the best-case scenario for representative democracy. But what if the feedback isn't that reliable? Or it takes a long time to arrive? Maybe Q is low.
Right. In situations where the feedback is less certain or slower, moderate Q, the model describes another possibility, partial pandering.
Partial pandering.
Yeah. Here, things are a bit more mixed. Some politicians, specifically, maybe those non-congruent ones who prefer the unpopular action when the popular one is actually optimal, might still choose the popular action just to play it safe and improve their reelection odds. But others might stick with what they personally believe is best.
So it's a mix of motivations driving behavior.
Exactly, and this partial pandering equilibrium can actually have both positive effects. It has a moral hazard correcting element. Some officials are induced to do the right thing, and an adverse selection correcting element. Voters still get some information from observing choices to help sort politicians.
Okay, so even with imperfect feedback, RD can still function reasonably well, with a mix of good behavior and some useful signaling.
It can, yes. It's more complex, but not necessarily dysfunctional.
What about that full pandering we talked about earlier, the bad kind, where politicians just tell us what we want to hear? Does feedback get rid of that completely?
The possibility of feedback makes that original full pandering, just choosing the popular action A regardless of anything, much harder to sustain as a stable strategy.
Why?
Because if there's a chance the truth will come out later that A was actually the wrong choice, then blindly pandering to prior beliefs becomes much riskier for the politician's reelection chances. Why stick your neck out for the popular but wrong choice if you might get caught?
The truth might bite you later.
Exactly. So, feedback acts as a discipline. As the saying goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more likely it is that the results of decisions will become known, the less likely politicians are to just chase short-term popularity without considering the actual merits.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the paper also briefly touches on how institutions within government can affect this feedback process.
Yeah.
You mentioned things like independent evaluation groups.
Right, exactly. Institutions like, say, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, or similar bodies in other countries, they play a vital role in improving the quality and availability of performance measurement. Essentially, they help increase Q, that probability of getting reliable feedback.
So they act as independent assessors.
Yes, they assess the performance of government programs and, by extension, the decisions of elected officials, providing more objective evaluations. And interestingly, the model suggests that these kinds of watchdogs are often most effective when they themselves are not directly accountable through elections.
Oh, wait, why? That seems counterintuitive again. Shouldn't everyone be accountable?
The logic is subtle. If these evaluation bodies were also worried about being popular or getting reelected, they might face their own pressures to pander in their evaluations.
Ah. They might soften their reports to avoid upsetting powerful politicians or the public.
Exactly. That could undermine their credibility and their ability to objectively expose when elected officials are pandering or performing poorly. Their independence, their lack of direct accountability, helps ensure they can provide that crucial, unbiased feedback.
That's a clever point. Unaccountable watchdogs, keeping the accountable officials honest. It's an interesting institutional design feature.
It is. And the paper argues this setup is most beneficial precisely when you're trying to evaluate accountable officials, where the risk of pandering by the officials themselves is highest.
Okay. Now, the final big shift of the paper is moving to a more complex and maybe more realistic picture of society, one with a majority group and a minority group who might have different preferences. How do the different systems stack up when minority rights explicitly enter the picture?
Right. This is where that potential tyranny of the majority we discussed earlier really comes into focus. The model now includes a situation where, say, the majority prefers action A, the minority prefers action B, but what's best for society as a whole isn't always A or B, it depends on the circumstances.
And they introduce different types of officials, too.
Yes. To make it more realistic, they consider officials who might be inherently biased.
Yeah.
Some always side with the majority, type M, some always side with the minority, type M, and some are welfare maximizers, type W, who try to do what's best for everyone, balancing the interests.
Okay, so it's a richer view. Conflicting group interests, potentially biased officials.
Yeah.
How does plain old direct democracy work here?
In direct democracy, it's straightforward. The majority wins. Always. Action A gets chosen every time.
Regardless of whether it's actually best for society or fair to the minority.
Regardless. So the overall well-being generated by direct democracy depends entirely on how often the majority's preference A happens to align with the overall social good and how bad things are, the loss L, when it doesn't. It's a pure reflection of majority power, warts and all.
Right. Back to the zoning example. The majority gets its way, even if it significantly disadvantages the minority homeowners. What about judicial power in this majority-minority context?
Under judicial power, the unelected official chooses their preferred policy. So the outcome depends on the mix of official types in the pool they're drawn from.
You mean how many M types, and W types there are?
Exactly. And also on the probabilities that each action, A or B, is actually the socially optimal one. Judicial power can sometimes protect minority interests, especially if there's a decent chance of getting a minority-sympathetic M-type or a welfare-maximizing W-type judge appointed. It avoids the automatic win for the majority that DD guarantees.
Okay, so JP offers at least a chance for the minority view or overall welfare to prevail. And finally, how does representative democracy fare with these conflicting group interests?
Well, as before, the performance of RD hinges critically on that office-holding motive, the delta.
High delta, strong motive.
If the desire to stay in office is very strong, high delta, leading to pandering, then representatives will likely just cater to the majority preference to maximize their chances of re-election. In this case, RD ends up looking pretty much like direct democracy, at least in the first period. The majority still dominates.
Okay. And if the office-holding motive is weaker, low delta, no pandering.
If delta is low and politicians vote their preferences, RD can offer some advantages over DD. Elections can potentially weed out representatives who are overtly biased against the majority, like an M-type official in a majority rules election.
But does it protect the minority?
It's still risky for the minority. Even without pandering, if most officials are either M-type or W-type, the majority's preferred action A might still get chosen very often, potentially more often than is socially optimal, especially if the benefit to the majority is high compared to the loss to the minority. Accountability still gears the system towards the majority's preferences, just maybe less automatically than DD.
So accountability can still lead to the majority view dominating, but the election mechanism might filter out the most extreme anti-majority officials. Is that a fair summary?
That's a key part of it. The model suggests a nuanced conclusion here. Representative democracy tends to be the best system when the probability that the majority's preference is the socially optimal one is in a kind of moderate range.
Moderate range.
Yeah, not too high, not too low. However, when there's a significant risk that the majority's preference will harm overall welfare or unfairly trample on minority rights, maybe the loss L is very large or the chance X that the majority is right is low, then judicial power, with its potential independence from the majority, tends to be the preferred system.
And direct democracy.
Direct democracy comes out best only when the majority's preference is very, very likely to be the best outcome for society as a whole, high X or high BL ratio. When you're pretty sure the majority knows best and the stakes for the minority aren't devastatingly high.
This sounds almost like a justification for constitutional protections, doesn't it? Things that courts enforce, taking decisions away from pure majority rule.
Exactly. Maskin and Tirole explicitly interpret things like the U.S. Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, in this light. They see it as a fundamental decision-allocating device.
Allocating decisions how?
Allocating decisions away from elected officials, RD, or direct majority vote, RD, and towards non-accountable courts, JP, precisely when fundamental rights, which often relate to minority interests, are jeopardized. It's like the Constitution implicitly says, in these specific areas, we think X is too low or L is too high, so we invoke judicial power as a safeguard.
Wow. That's a really powerful way to think about the role of a constitution and judicial review. It's not just abstract principles. It's a mechanism design choice based on these trade-offs.
Precisely. It's about structuring government to handle the inherent tensions between majority will, minority rights, and overall welfare.
Okay, let's try to bring this all together then. What are the really big lessons, the key takeaways from this deep dive into Maskin and Tirole's work?
I think there are a few main ones. First, accountability through elections is definitely a double-edged sword. Vital, potentially, but tricky.
Right. Helps screen and discipline, but risks pandering and ignoring minorities.
Well, exactly. Second, there's no single best system for making public decisions. The ideal choice, direct democracy, representative democracy, or judicial power, really depends on the context.
Context like?
Like how much politicians care about re-election versus legacy, how easily we can observe the real outcomes of policies, how costly it is to get good information, and crucially, how diverse or conflicting the interests within society are.
Okay. Third takeaway.
Third, maybe counterintuitively sometimes, it can actually be better to have non-accountable officials making certain decisions, especially highly technical ones, or when fundamental minority rights are seriously at risk.
Right, and judges.
And finally, the design of our institutions matters a lot. Things like how long terms are, how much discretion officials have, and whether we have effective, independent bodies monitoring performance. These details can significantly shape how well accountability works or doesn't work.
So it's all about the details, the context, and managing these inherent trade-offs. Accountability isn't some magic bullet. It's a tool with specific strengths and weaknesses.
Well put.
Thinking about all these ideas, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we evaluate the current balance of power between elected officials and the judiciary in different political systems today? Are there areas where maybe a different approach, leaning more towards one system or another, might better serve the public interest and protect minority rights?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Or, here's another thought. As technology evolves, and things like online voting make direct democracy seem potentially much easier to implement on a large scale, what kind of safeguards might we need? How do we avoid that tyranny of the majority risk that this research highlights so clearly if we move more towards direct public votes?
Huge questions, really important ones to grapple with, drawing on insights like these.
Definitely some fascinating things to mull over. Thanks so much for walking us through this.
My pleasure. It's fascinating work.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.